Hello, friends. Welcome to On the Couch program. We are super excited that you'll be joining us. On the Couch is going to be aired every Friday evening at 7 p.m. on our YouTube channel. This program will be focused on answering questions around really difficult topics of finance, family dynamics, parenting, dating, and divorce. So if any of these topics are affecting anyone that you care about or even yourself, please tune in for some biblical answers. We would love to hear from you as well on your own questions. So please send that in to our email address, which will be located in the details below. Thanks so much. We look forward to hearing from you.
Financial problems, troubled family relationships, unplanned pregnancy, broken marriage, delinquent children, or overwhelming grief. Are you burdened by the care of life? Are you feeling hopeless? Friend, whatever you are going through, whatever questions you may have, God has the answers. We invite you to join us on the couch, a Bible-based program that will give you insight into what the Bible says about these critical issues of life. We present to you On the Couch, finding hope in the midst of a crisis.
Welcome back to another episode of On the Couch. We're very excited this evening to have a special guest with us, Tamara Bird, and we'll be talking about divorce, a topic that is, I wouldn't say a hot topic, but it is something that is becoming more and more prevalent. And Tamara, would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself?
Well, I could say I started working in the ministry in the church since I was 15. And I preface that because I work with at-risk youth, and I did work with youth that experienced divorce and so forth. And then I became a counselor in training and transitioned to young adults. And I think that was baptismal by fire for me, because in that age group, it's where I saw the most divorce happening. And currently I'm in marriage ministry. So in my clinical practice as a mid-level provider, I do see the issues of divorce, but it's more for the assessment of depression and mental health.
Thank you, Tamara. So let's start off by just kind of discussing a little bit about divorce. How prevalent is divorce now? You know, I think statistics vary from year to year, but how, in what you've seen in the work that you've done, how prevalent has divorce become?
So we were talking earlier about statistics, and I didn't bring any because, like you said, depending where you go, the numbers will vary, and then it breaks down into demographics of age and culture and so much. So it's a lot of information to retain. But when we focus on the Christian home, where before people were more willing to try and work things out, we have been seeing a trend of divorce going up in the Christian home, and more so in the younger generations in their 30s. Young adults per se age group.
Now, is there a specific reason why that happens? Is it societal? Is it, have people stop believing in marriage? Is it, what would you say attributes to that?
That's a multifactorial question in the sense that you have to look at different factors. So to sum it up, or to give you a short answer, it's a combination both of our spirituality is changing. There's a lot of injection of our cultural belief of secular beliefs coming into the church, and the definition of marriage has changed. Marriage is considered a covenant, which is a pledge that you make for life. And marriage today seems more like a contract. We exchange goods, and when somebody breaks that contract, I walk out. So the commitment level may not quite be there. And I don't want to generalize that to everything, but not, due to time, I'm just giving you a little bit of synapse of what's going on in the general church.
I think it's interesting, that you mentioned that we've seen kind of a small trend in, divorce in the Christian church, and, like you said, we tend to believe that once we get married, we're married for life. Mm-hmm. My parents have been married for 30 plus years. I'm sure we all know somebody that, they've been married for 30, 40 years now. And it seems like when it hits home that it's something different. Like you don't know what you go through when it comes to divorce. And I think one of the main questions is, okay, well, how do we get to that point of thinking about getting divorced? What factors are there that lead people to think that divorce is the only way out?
I think it all depends on the group that you're looking at. If we're looking at young adults, it's more of a commitment issue, or it's an issue of I can leave this at any time and I can find better. But divorce it's a situation as you get older. It depends on the circumstances. Statistics will tell you that as the marriage goes on, adultery and other things can creep into a marriage, and therefore, and there's this thing as marriage fatigue. The
7-year itch.
So there's different factors that affect that, but I think it gets down to the point, depending on their circumstances. Is it addiction? Is it pornography? Is it adultery? Or is it that you're not meeting my needs? So a lot of times it's me thinking about myself, and therefore you're not meeting what I need, so I'm going to find it somewhere else. And that's a lie that I believe either society or the devil may put in us, to think the grass is greener on the other side. Now, when you deal with abuse, whether it's physical, sexual, or mental, or when you're dealing with pornography or addiction, that's totally different. Because it affects not only the person who's committing such actions, but the other spouse, and if there's children, even more. So that's a whole different ballgame there.
Okay. So, as Christians, we tend to think that because we're Christians, we have, everything is all sunshine and rainbows and everything's going to go good for us. And we tend to believe that lie, and we tend to believe that maybe divorce won't hit me because I'm faithful, because I'm good to God, because I've done this, that, and the other thing. But divorce hits my home. Do I blame God? Do I blame myself? Do I blame my spouse? How do I deal with that? How do I deal with those feelings of thinking maybe God is punishing me for something that I've done or haven't done?
So all those questions people will ask themselves, when you're dealing with divorce, you're talking about a dissolution of a union. It's a death of a union. It's you losing those promises you made to each other, the future you plan with each other, and it's equated to a death. So when you do that, you are going to experience a range of emotions. You're going to go from anger to anxiety to depression, bargaining, denial. So there's no, like you said, there's a bunch of emotions. There's questioning whether God loves me. Why did he allow this? So it's very, there's a lot of questions. And as we go through, I think we'll address some of these as we go through. But let's, for example, take the emotional aspect of divorce. What I get often is, how do I deal with these emotions? Grief, anger, loss, everything. And I normally tell whoever I'm speaking with that this journey is your journey. There's no right way to grieve. And so you go into the situation where I explain to them, if you talk about grieving, you will hear about the stages of grief. And depending which model you're looking at, may have 5, 7, or different. And I tell them, don't get fixated on it, but let's learn so that you can be informed, and that way you understand the process you're going through. For example, the 5 stages of grief, you're looking at denial, you're looking at anger, you're looking at bargaining, depression, and acceptance. So there's different stages of that. When it comes to those things, some of them are coping, some of them are masking. And in the end, it's a combination of seeking support, professional, as well as spiritual, and having the right support system to help you get through those emotions. For example, people talk about denial as something negative, but in this stage of grief, we actually see it as a coping mechanism. It helps you absorb what's going on at the rate that you need to, and kind of, when you're ready, you start to filter the information you just received. You may feel numb and confused, but it can be healthy. Anger is considered more of a masking mechanism, where you hide your emotions and you just put them all under anger. And that one is hard, because you can either misplace your anger to someone else, or I've even seen people take it out on objects. Unfortunately, they end up in the hospital because they take it out. But and it's a normal process. And it doesn't have to be outright rage. It could be bitterness, it could be resentment, it can manifest in different ways. Bargaining is a tricky one because bargaining sometimes, depending on the circumstances, can occur before the divorce and definitely after. And so you're bargaining with yourself, with your former spouse, or your spouse if you know the divorce is coming, or with God. And so that's where the questions come in. God, if you only this, God, if that, God, if that. And then you also start to ask yourself those what if only questions. What if I did this, or if only he did that? And that's normal. Just don't stay there too long, because sometimes it's not that healthy to keep going around, because that doesn't mean that if you change your circumstances, you wouldn't end up in the same situation. And so you go into depression. Depression sometimes gets a bad rep. Depression can be healthy. If you need to step away from people around you to process and to cope with what you're going through and process your emotion, it is healthy. Now, it can also be difficult and sticky if you can get stuck here and you feel hopelessness and you feel like nobody cares and you have what's called early awakening. Early awakening is when you're dead asleep and at 3 or 4 in the morning, you just wake up wide awake and no outside stimulus wakes you, just wide awake. Some people overeat, some people undereat, and then there's the emotions, outbursts of emotions. And that's one that I get calls on, and they're like, I'm sitting here and I'm at work and I'm just crying my eyes out and people are looking at me. But it happens, it's the way your body has to process that stuff. And then you get to acceptance, and that doesn't mean that you are over your grief or that you're in a happy place, but it means that you are empowered, you feel like you can make a plan, you have a goal. And so you start to get a grip on things and you start to now become goal-oriented. So there's different stages, and you have to be able to give yourself the time, the permission to grieve, to process, and accept that you are loved and that the message you got through this divorce may be not a good message, that you're unworthy, that you were abandoned. But remember, God loves you. He loves you enough that he died for you. And he gave his life, his son, Jesus Christ, gave his life for you. So find your worth in him, not in what other people think about you.
I find that interesting because we tend to think, in the stages of grief, we tend to go through that stage, and hopefully not everybody, but we get to that point where we begin to become angry with God. That anger gets displaced and it gets sent to God. And we say, well, God, why did you allow this to happen? Why is this happening to me? Did God allow this?
So when I get that question, I always come back to the individual and I say, God didn't permit this. What he permitted and gave us is free will. And with that free will comes the responsibility of our decisions and the consequences of those decisions. So shortly, unless you want God to take away the free will of your spouse or former spouse and control him like a puppet, he or she has free will. So we have to accept the free will of the individual. That doesn't mean that God will not intervene on your behalf, but then you have to look at the fact, is the person recognizing the intervention? And if they are they willing to accept the intervention, which goes back to free will. There's another factor you have to consider, which is biblical, that talks about when Moses says, because of the hardening of your hearts, they allowed divorce. As time has gone on, our hearts have become hardened. And you can see that in society. I sometimes reflect on when you see things happening and you see everybody recording and nobody steps in. And before, if you see, let's say you would see something bad happening, people would go to the rescue. Now everybody just sits there and records it and puts it on social media. So there has been a numbing of our hearts, per se. And then there's a third party involved, and that's always Lucifer, Satan. So you have to give accountability to that as well. So to answer your question, you have to look at the free will. God will not take that away from you or from your former spouse. So the choices they make is what put you in this place.
What I take away from that is that we need to be active in how we interact with our spouses. We have to be active and engaged and thinking, I want my marriage to succeed, so I need to do everything possible to make sure that we make that succeed. It has to come from me. It takes, we tend to say it's a 50-50 thing. But in reality, it's 100%, 100%, because if I'm only putting 50% into my marriage, and my wife is only putting 50% into the marriage, there's still a whole 50% there that's, getting displaced somewhere else. So we have to give 100% if we want our marriage to succeed. The Bible says that we have to die daily to ourselves and then be reborn in Christ on a daily basis. I think that the same thing could be applied with our marriages. We have to commit ourselves on a daily basis to say, you know what, I'm going to do the best that I can for my family, whether I have children, whether it's just me and my spouse. I have to make sure that I do everything possible to make sure that our marriages succeed. But it seems like that's becoming more and more difficult, like you said, because society is pushing us to this closed offness and to become a lot colder and to think, like you said, maybe the grass is greener on the other side. I don't like this, that, and the other thing about my spouse. Maybe I can find it in somebody else. And you start looking for those things in something else instead of communicating with your spouse and saying, hey, you know what? I don't really like this, or this bugs me. Instead of communicating with that to our spouse, we go and look for it somewhere else. So I find that very interesting. And divorce doesn't, necessarily just affect us, like you say. If we have a family, it affects the kids. So how do we deal with that? How do we deal when two parents get divorced? How do we tell our kids? How do we guide our kids through that process if it's an amicable split? If we're both okay, it's mutual agreement. How do we deal with that?
So the first thing I always say is seek counseling for the children during the divorce process and after. A lot of times it's more a reactive counseling. You wait until you see the disaster in your child, and then you get the counseling. I advise to, if you already know you're heading that way, seek counseling for the children before you head that way. The other thing you need to do is you need to sit down and you need to explain to your children what's happening and be clear that these are adult issues, that there's nothing they have done that has led to this. And because it is an adult issue, there's nothing that they can do to fix it. Because when you divorce, children sometimes think it's because of them, and they may blame themselves even though they're not saying it. And so the message has to be clear that these are two adult issues, two adults having issues that need to be resolved by the adults and not by the children. And you need to make sure that they understand that they are loved. And that is key, because if they don't understand the concept of love through the relationship they have with their parents, that sets them up for failure in every aspect of life. Because love affects everything, whether we want to believe it or not. And I'm not talking about romantic love. It's love for the fellow man, yes, romantic as well, and love for God. And God is love. So if you destroy love, you destroy the image of God.
So in an ideal world, all divorces would be amicable. Everybody would be in agreement. But you have the one spouse that's more angry with the other one. Is the process still the same when we talk about dealing with divorce with the children? Do I as an individual parent take the initiative and take my kids to counseling either way and explain to them, even if my spouse isn't in agreement or doesn't want to talk about it anymore?
Well, somebody has to be the parent. Somebody has to be the adult. And the responsibility of those children is both adults involved. But if one of them is saying, I'm done, and walks away or doesn't want to deal with it, unfortunately, the other person has to pick up the pieces. When it's a nasty divorce per se, I always recommend to have mediators. And there is mediators for everything. You're going to have one when you go through the process of divorce. And then I always advise that you have a mediator for co-parenting. And especially if the divorce was not a friendly divorce. And there are mediators for co-parenting that will help be exactly that between you and your former spouse. They'll communicate, they'll help form what's called a family plan. And if you've never heard of that family plan normally is what the custody plan. And if you didn't do it during divorce, you should do it. And it's a breakdown of the rules and regulations when it comes to visitations, holidays, medicals, and so forth. And on top of that, if the other spouse already has a significant other in the picture, then you look at what we call the step parent plan. And it's good to have those, especially a mediator, because it helps resolve issues that otherwise the children will get dragged into and be put in the middle of that. And that's not healthy.
So will not talking about divorce lead my kids to think that there is no benefit to being married anymore? Or does divorce cause my children to think that there is no point to getting married?
From what I've seen from my experience, and I'll go off of that, oftentimes what I see the issue of marriage coming to children is more so when you're dealing with dysfunctional family units, and normally they will ultimately lead to divorce. But it's not so much the divorce in itself, it's the dysfunction in the family that makes them think this is not worth it. Because unless you're blindsided with this divorce, you normally, with adultery or something like that, that's a different story. If the dysfunction is already occurring, the children are going to wonder, why would I want to marry somebody to live this way? So we're dealing with the before more so than the after. But if you are blindsided, yes, divorce can affect the perspective of a child in marriage. So that's why it's essential when you go through divorce, whether it was something like you saw it coming because there's just dysfunctional coping skills in the relationship, or whether it was something that blindsided you. Either way, it doesn't matter. For the sake of children, you need to provide stability for them. You need to, whoever has the children needs to be stable. They need to be open and honest with them, answer the question in an honest way, age appropriate, of course. You're not going to have, R-rated conversation with a 5-year-old. And no matter how you feel about your ex-spouse, do not talk bad about them in front of your children. And your job is to listen, to answer, be honest, be loving, reassure them. And the second best thing you can do, aside from, we already talked about providing counseling for them, spiritual as well. The second thing you can do is surround them with positive role models. So use your church unit as a help for that, because I can tell you many times when people divorce, if the children have a connection to an older couple, they are stable, they're happy, it's a quiet home, peaceful, they notice those things. And they also can, reach out to certain peer groups depending on their age to help them process these. And sometimes, depending on your church, there's youth directors that can facilitate that. But the best thing you can do is, like I said, surround them with positive role models, example of good relationship, so they can see that, yes, this can work.
Okay. So, most of the times when people come and say, I'm thinking of the divorce, one of the first things that I've seen people tell them is, why don't you try to work it out first? Let's see if you can get to the bottom of the issues that are at hand. And let's say that, my spouse is saying, yeah, I want to reconcile, but that there's underlying issues, whether it be addiction to, pornography, drugs, whether it be adultery or something like that, is the Christian thing to do still to try to reconcile with that person, or do I have to take another path?
So you kind of went over different stages of why you get divorced. So if it's because of personal issues, the biblical stance is that you should reconcile with your spouse. If you look into the Bible for answers of divorce, there's only 3 circumstances that allows for divorce in the Bible. And one of them is Matthew 19, and I think Mark, I don't remember exactly, but it's in Mark also. It talks about adultery or fornication or sexual immorality, depending on the translation that you're looking at. And if you need clarity on what sexual immorality is, you can go to Leviticus 18, chapter 18 and chapter 20, and Romans chapter 1, and they give you the details. The other one is if you married an unbelieving spouse and they choose to leave, then let them go. And that's in 1 Corinthians 7. And then you have if your spouse dies. So, and that's in Romans chapter 1, I believe, or 7. Look it up, but it's in there. So under the biblical perspective, if you are divorcing for any other reason than that, then you should. God doesn't like divorce. He's and I think it is in Matthew 19. He said from the beginning it wasn't so. And in the pledge, he said, "Let what God has put together, no one separate."
Mhm.
So yes, you should reconcile. Now, I preface that with the fact that if you're in a dangerous relationship and it is dangerous to yourself or to your children, then you need intervention. And you should hold off the reconciliation until the proper intervention has occurred. You can't leave due to adultery if you're not the one committing the adultery. But otherwise, separation is an option, intervention is an option. And I'm giving you a biblical answer, obviously, because from the world's perspective, you don't have to stay, you can leave.
So I think I find that interesting that there are, like you said, the Bible outlines a few different things, but for the most part, the Bible tells us to stay together, unless it's something extreme like, adultery. Can you reconcile after adultery? Is it possible to do that?
So when there's adultery, you're dealing with the issue of trust.
Mhm.
So the question that I would put back to you is, can I learn to trust? Can I trust? And the answer is yes, you can learn to trust, but that process is not an easy process. That process takes a while. It's small steps, and you have to start to trust yourself first before you can then go and start trusting others. Because if you don't trust yourself, you will never get to the point where you can trust others. Adultery is it's hard because that trust is broken. And then unless you're willing to take the extra steps needed to mend that trust, and you're capable of forgiveness and willing to reconcile, it will be hard because you're going to be in a relationship and everything that person does, you're going to question. You're going to question their motive, their actions, what they're saying, and you're going to drive yourself crazy, and you're not going to have peace of mind. So the answer is yes, but it all depends on two things. Are you willing to reconcile? Are you willing to put the effort to build this trust and give that person a second chance? And is the person who committed adultery repented from their action? Because if they're going to keep doing it, then I am hesitant to say, then it's not, don't go there,
And we'll have a talk about this in a future episode. Let's move to another question. So we talked about a little while ago when we're going through the process, if there is a stepmother or if there is a significant other at that point, my spouse has moved on. How do I deal with that?
So that goes back to it is a personal journey, and we talked about those stages briefly, but it goes back to the last stage, which is acceptance. You have to be willing to accept that this is over. You have to be willing to accept that obviously the person has moved on. So it's a matter of whether you are willing to accept this or not. It's easier said than done. There's some things you can do. One of the things you can do is remove things that remind you of that person from your home and everything, especially if you're in the same house. If you're in a new place, hopefully you didn't drag everything with you. But if there's stuff, remove those things that remind you of your former spouse. Except your kids, and I'm being clear because, with today's society, you have to be clear. So, and then you have the other thing, don't touch your children's room. Remove stuff from yours, but not theirs, because that's their parents, so they need to hold on to that. Aside from that, if you have friends that share the same circle as your former spouse and you, it may be beneficial for you at this moment to not be friends or put that on pause for now. So that way you're not getting feedback from them either, and you're not asking them, because it's easy for us to jump into this, oh, what did you see? What did you hear? Or what, And most important is social media, because social media plays a role in spying on people, in the sense that I may block my former spouse, but then I jump into my friend's site and look for whatever they're posting about him. So I say, block your social media, make yours private, and for right now, block those same friends that are in the same circle so that you're not tempted to keep going back and forth and torturing yourself. So basically, it's removing yourself from the presence of that former spouse. because if not, they're going to consume your time and energy that you should be using for rebuilding yourself, but you're going to give it all to that person. And you have to wonder, what is your worth? How do you see yourself? Because why would you want to continue feeling for someone? And I know that marriage is hard, but you have to accept the fact that you're a child of God. You're worth something. Respect yourself, love yourself, and remove yourself from a situation that a person doesn't respect you, doesn't love you, doesn't care for you. So find people who are worthy to be in your life. Aside from that, you have to be willing to go through the process of detachment.
I feel like we keep coming back to that same well of, going through the process of grieving. We tend to be masochists to a certain extent when we're dating, my boyfriend or my girlfriend leaves me, and I go and spy on them to see what they're doing now. Is he or she living their life, to the fullest now? And while I'm over here sulking in misery, and it's funny how that translates also to marriage. We tend to go back to that. Like, I want to know what they're doing. Are they doing okay? Why are they so happy? Why am I so miserable? And again, like you said, it goes back to that grieving process. But it's easier said than done sometimes, because we want, if we're the victim, if we feel that we're the victim, I don't want to say that we're always the victim, but if we feel like we're the victim, we don't want them to be okay. We don't want them to be happy, so how do I put those emotions in check? I don't want my spouse to be happy. Why should they be happy? If they were the ones that caused something, how do I deal with that?
And that's why I go back to, you have to assess your self-worth. And you have to look at your previous relationships and how those relationships, what happened in those relationships. If your first dating experience was a positive one and it confirmed your self-worth, and the next one and the next one, normally you then have a healthier attitude and you're able to walk away easier. Not that it's not painful, but it's easier. So you look at self-worth, you look at the relationship, the dynamics, and you need counseling, because even if you are considering yourself the victim, I heard a counselor once say, it takes two to make a marriage and it takes two to break one. So there are things that we also contributed, whether we know it or not, to this situation. Not always, but most of the time. So the counseling will help you. Professional counseling will help you assess what is going on with you. Why do you still feel like you need to linger and check up on him? And what is it that's going on with you at a deeper level, disconnected from the divorce, that has led you to become this type of individual? And again, I'm not only talking about professional counseling, you also need spiritual counseling, because in this whole process of divorce, like you mentioned, we can blame God and we can be angry with God and we can walk away from our faith. And so spiritual counseling is essential, and it will help you refocus your self-worth to how God sees you and how God loves you and how you are worth everything to this God that you know. So,
No, I mean, it's, like you said, we have to, it's a long history, the way that when we're dating, and we talked about this in a dating episode, but dating is a pathway that leads us to marriage ultimately. Not every person that we date is going to be the person that we marry, but it builds on that foundation. And if we don't build a solid foundation, or if we don't have our principles set on a solid foundation, which would be Christian principles or whatever, what have you, then it's easier for us to go down that path of being of not knowing what our self-worth is and thinking that we're the ones that it's because of me or this, that, and the other thing, and then we go down a rabbit hole of making bad decisions after we get divorced. So I think having that solid foundation, like you said from the very beginning, is going to help us build a stronger marriage. So my spouse has moved on. I'm not happy about it. I've accepted it. But now my spouse doesn't want to spend any time with my kids. or is not spending as much time as I'd like for them to spend with my kids. What do I do then?
So if your breakup, divorce was amicable to a certain degree, because it's still a divorce, I would advise that is, as long as it's safe, to reach out to that former spouse, especially if you did the family planning, and say, hey, remember, the issues between you and me, not the children. They need you present. You can have functional children if both parents agree to set their issues aside for the sake of the children and love them and just reiterate that message that you are worth everything. But again, it goes back to free will. I have seen people that get divorced and the other parent just walks away. It's not easy. It's not easy. The best thing, going back to, besides repeating myself, the counseling and surrounding them with that positive network of people that are a good influence in their life. But sometimes all you can do is just listen. And all you can do is acknowledge their grief and be honest with them. And if they get angry and if they blame you, sometimes it's hard, but you have to pick up the pieces.
I feel like, in the day and age that we are now, counseling is starting to be less of a taboo. People used to think, oh, well, you only go to counseling or you only go see a psychologist if you're crazy. That's how people used to think about it. But now it's almost encouraged. Go to counseling, go talk about your feelings, go tell somebody what you're thinking, what you're going through, talking about it, like you said, is always going to be the best option, because I could have pent up feelings and think that my ex-husband is now the worst father in the world because he doesn't want to spend time with his kids. But maybe I need to reanalyze that a little bit and think, what else could he be going through? Maybe he needs time for himself. And again, to give the benefit of the doubt to the other person. But it's, it just, I feel like there would be something else that I could do, to encourage my spouse to interact with my kids or our kids, because they're our kids. But sometimes it doesn't happen. Like you say, they just walk away, and I don't know. And how do I explain to my kids or our kids, how do I explain to them that, their father doesn't really want to interact with them anymore, or doesn't want to spend a lot of time with them? How do we tell them that? How do we address that issue?
I would never say to a child, your father or mother doesn't want to be with you, because that's devastating. Let's go back a little bit. Divorce is a traumatic event. And it's a traumatic event for everybody involved, including the perpetrator. And so when you do that, when you're dealing with a traumatic event, you're dealing with a bunch of emotions. But in addition, you're dealing with guilt, shame, and blame. And so sometimes what I see, and this is not to excuse this parent, is that when they see their children, it reminds them and the guilt overwhelms them. And for selfish reasons, they remove themselves from the picture because they can't cope with the guilt. I would venture to say, don't speculate what the other person is thinking or doing. You can only do that for yourself. But for the children's sake, especially because when they go through divorce, the window of life, what they see life through, changes. They have a new identity. They're displaced from what they know. The parents they have are not the same, because when you go through a divorce, you're not going to be the same pre-divorce, post-divorce. You change. So they're dealing with parental change. They're dealing most likely with their being displaced from their home, and that means a new school, new church, new set of friends, and they're dealing with a new identity of themselves. So there's so much that they're dealing with. It's essential that if you can, and the parents are able to do so, to overlook their issues for the benefit of the children. And there is such thing as co-parenting mediators. And so if you're not able to speak with your spouse because it was not a hard divorce, go to a co-parenting mediator, and they will then become the mediator between you and that person. What I see a lot, though, is the parents will use the child or children to manipulate the other individual, and then it causes the individual to just not want to deal with the whole situation altogether. And unfortunately, the one that suffers are the children. So we have to reflect on what we are doing that may want to if we're doing anything, I'm not saying you are, that makes that other spouse not want to come around. So if they don't want anything to do with you, that's fine. Just follow the family plan if you have one. If you don't have one, make one. If you need a mediator, get one. Use the resources available to you to help you through this process. And sometimes we as parents want to do everything for our children, but there's limit to what we can do, especially if they're angry and they're blaming you, you know.
When can I move on? When is it okay for me to say, you know what, this is enough time, you know, I think I'm ready to put myself out there again? How little of time is too little and how long is too long? Or is there no such thing?
There's no such thing. Well, there is such thing as too little. But there's no such thing as to how long your journey is going to take. It can take a few months, years. It depends. It depends how long you've been married. It depends what happened in the marriage. It depends what promises were broken. And it depends how committed you were into this marriage. So it's a lot of factors to think about. But yes, it could be too short. And often what I see is people feel lonely and they feel hurt. And in order to cover that void of pain and loneliness, they start dating too soon. And they date and they use, for the coping mechanism, dating and sex. And that's not healthy, because what you're doing is hurting yourself more and you will end up making the same mistakes. And every time you give a piece of yourself to someone, every time you date, you give a piece of yourself to that individual. And you barely have enough of you at this moment to make it by. And if you keep giving a piece, what's going to be left of you? How are you going to rebuild yourself if you keep doing that? So you have to wait. You have to wait. I think the signal for you will be when you start to feel like, okay, I'm more empowered. My self-esteem is coming back. I can think clearer, not completely. I have goals. And then at that moment, you may want to consider dating. If you have children, that's a whole different ballgame, because everything you do affects them. And so you have to take them into consideration. And that's where these open conversations, honest conversations have to occur. If they're not ready, you're going to have to wait, because they didn't ask to be put in the situation. And so unfortunately, and most likely the other person didn't, but unfortunately they are. So they come first. They should come first, not always.
So when I get to that point where I'm, you know, my kids are okay, if I have a family, if my kids are okay with it, I'm okay with it. How do I go about finding that person? Do I look in the church? Do I look online? Do I look in some other type of community? What advice would you give to somebody that's in that position?
Of looking. So the question I normally get when they start looking is, it's so hard to find a Christian person. Do I go and compromise, or do I pray for God to change them, or do I, you know, go onto social media and things like that? And like I said, a lot of times what I get is this compromise question: do I lower my standards? And so to answer your question, you can go to different ways: friends, family, and media, and find someone. But I think you need to start to reflect on, what does God want for you? Mm-hmm. And are you going to compromise yourself to find someone? And often that's the case that I see. You have a Christian family breaks up, and then suddenly the person who either, not the perpetrator, but the one that was asked for the divorce, later when they're ready, they start dating people that they normally wouldn't date. And so I say to that, stop, pause, because if you're compromising yourself, your relationship is bound to fail, because there's so much that you can compromise. And with time, all of those things you compromise will come back. And the person that you're dating or with, they're going to say, wait, this is not this is not you. And so what happened? So when it comes to dating, it's tricky, because it's an issue of, where do I look? Are there Christian people out there? And do I lower my standards? And so you can look in different venues. Yes, there's Christian people out there, but I would say never lower your standards, because the God that you know is the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. And if you want him to bless that relationship, you cannot compromise him and then ask him to bless your relationship.
Yeah, and I think that was the gist of my question. Not necessarily how do I start dating, but do I maintain the same standards across my dating life? And at that point, and like you said, we should. Why do I need to compromise my beliefs, or why should I compromise with my beliefs? We tend to go when something bad happens to us, we tend to go off the rails. We tend to go and do things that we would never do. Some people go and get piercings, some people go and get tattoos, some people go and they start drinking. We go through all these different things that some people can say, oh, well, that's just part of their grieving process, but we don't see how harmful that can be to us in the long run. And I think that's the mistake that we want to avoid, is don't jump into something or don't do something that's going to, affect a relationship that I could possibly have later down the road when I'm ready to, put myself back out there and possibly get remarried. So on the question of getting remarried, when can I get remarried? If I were to do that, if they were to divorce me, when would that happen?
When can you remarry?
Yeah.
Time-wise?
Which is, it again, I think it goes back to the same question. Is there too little of time to wait to get remarried? I think that's the question.
Yes, there's too little. So marriage should not be entered lightly, especially if you're already in this divorce situation. And going back, hopefully you don't compromise your standards. And you have to realize that you were put in a situation that you were not looking for. So you have to also acknowledge that you have to place the blame in the right individual, and not so much on, oh, I had these standards and it failed. The person has free will. They will do what they want. So you shouldn't jump into marriage 6 months after. I'd say don't go into marriage if you're, it's hard. It's not for me to say when. Mm-hmm. I guess that's the question. Yeah. I can't say when, but you can do that. You can be premature, mm-hmm. and you need to make sure that you have the best you when you go into any relationship after divorce. Because if God is presenting you the person, you want to make sure that you're at your best, so that way this can function. And not at your worst wait. If you're not where you need to be, wait, because you may miss out on a blessing altogether if you're too, if you jump the gun per se, mm-hmm. if you're too eager to do something.
So after divorce, can I trust somebody ever again? Can I ever get to that point of trusting people?
Yes, you can learn to trust. And if let's say you got to the point where you're ready to go into a relationship, you have to remember that you have to deal with your issues. There's a few tips that I normally say, if you find yourself, let's say you're in a relationship, dating, and you find yourself getting on the bandwagon of mistrust, gather the information, acknowledge your mistrustful thoughts, ask yourself, are my fears affecting my perspective, my judgment, and therefore causing issues in this relationship? Or are the issues rising out of this relationship a combination of my personal issues and discrepancy in the other person, or is it an issue of them or just me? So you have to ask yourself the real questions, and you have to go back to learning to trust yourself, your intuition. This starting to trust your intuition will help build your self-trust and small steps. Remember, you cannot go through life blaming everything on someone else. You have to take responsibility for your actions and your reaction. So if you're noticing you're not bringing your best self to these interactions, and therefore you're reacting to things that maybe you shouldn't, pause. Address those issues with yourself, or if you can with the person you're dating, address them in real time, and don't wait to bury them and then just dump a bunch of grievances all at once. Be honest in the relationship. If you're struggling, be open and say, hey, I'm struggling with this. I'm not advising you to be too open, but be real And again, if you're having issues, it goes back to having the proper support system, whether it's professional counseling, spiritual counseling, and a healthy network around yourself. The other thing you have to realize is we're human. In any relationship, there's going to be setback, mistakes will happen, and you have to allow for that. What you have to look for is intent. And if there was intent, then you have an issue.
So, what advice would you give to a young married couple? They're starting out on, not necessarily on how to avoid divorce per se, but how to build a strong marriage so that we never get to that point of divorce.
Well, when you're dealing with young couples, you deal with different issues. I mean, and it's not a young couple. It goes to dating, and there was an episode on dating prior to this somewhere. How you date sets the precedence for your relationship. And so if you are dating and there's a bunch of compromises being made from both sides, or one side, however you want to put it, this is a recipe for disaster. So you should be genuine with with the person you're with. You should be honest. If you have core values, especially spiritual values, religious values that are different, you need to be able to say, hey, these are essential to me, and this is what I believe. Unfortunately, the Bible does say don't be unequally yoked. I mean, fortunately, the Bible does tell you not to be unequally yoked, because that in itself is kind of a recipe for disaster. Not that it cannot work, but it's just more obstacles to come. Marriage is a hard thing. It's a commitment. It's something you have to work for. I have been married for 23 years. I laugh because I have to think about it. 23 years. And I can tell you, when I got married, I was under the illusion of, the prince that comes and rescue me, the Cinderella stuff. And so I have bought into this ideology of love, which is very much what we see in our culture. He will cross the hottest desert and he will climb the biggest mountain and all this stuff. So when problems started to arise, it was interesting to realize, wait a minute, this is not what I expected. This is not what I thought it would be. He is a good man, but my idea was not, things started to creep up. So then you start to learn to develop coping skills. And that's where I'm going at. A lot of us enter relationship without the proper coping skills. And so if we don't have the proper skills, then we need to get them. And so premarital counseling can help you with that. If you have issues that you're bringing, because with every person you date, you have a luggage. And every time you date, you put a little bit in that luggage. Mm-hmm. And some of that luggage can get really heavy. So you have to be able to unload the luggage, especially if you're looking at this person as someone that you want to spend your life with, because it's not fair that you bring all of this baggage from previous relationship to someone who may not be that person and who is a good person, and you're making them pay for that. So you have to also assess yourself. And if you need to, go somewhere, seek counseling or premarital counseling, and open that suitcase and start dumping some of that luggage, some of that stuff out. Go together and, make sure that you're able to attain these skills for yourself and as a couple. Okay. And the other thing is, you need God. And I'm not saying that as the last thing. I'm saying it in the end because I think it's important. I want you to remember this. Without God, life is hard as it is. And God needs to be in a marriage because he is love. And he is the example and the epitome of love. And it's a sacrificial love. It's sometimes a love that you may feel like you're giving more than the other person. But the Bible says that you should love yourself, the other person. For example, the husband should love their wife. And to the point like God gave his life for the church. If a man loves me that much, I'm going to give everything to him because I know he has my best interest at heart. And marriage is a covenant. So when you see the other person not keeping their end, you need to help them. You need to be there. When they're down, you pick them up. And when you're down, they pick you up. It needs to be a mutual thing. It needs to be a selfless love. It needs to be patient. It needs to be understanding. And these are skills that sometimes you gain in the marriage. For me, some of these I gained them as we went through this 23-year journey. But it's doable. And you just need to start thinking of the other person more so than yourself, because selfish love is going to end in destruction.
Thank you, Tamara, for sitting down with us and having this conversation about divorce and marriage and a little bit of everything. And we really appreciate your insight. We want to ask you to join us next week for another exciting episode of On the Couch, where we will discuss more about topics like marriage, divorce, dating, finances, and so many other things. So please join us next week for another exciting episode of On the Couch.
Hello, friends. We are super excited that you have been able to be a part of the On the Couch program. I'm sure that a lot of you are really enjoying this and maybe even have other questions that are outside of this program. We would love to help you through that and point you in the direction of what the Bible says about those things. If you have any other questions or interest on what this is all about, please look into the details below on Access, which is a wonderful community. It's a church located in Sugar Land who can help you through this. If you want to know more about that, just check out the link, and also please hit the like button.